I've never been someone who believes in the supernatural. I'm a doctor, and in our profession we get used to seeing all sorts of things. But what happened that night in the hospital, I still struggle to find an explanation for it. It was a stormy night. I was working in a small and quite old hospital, located in a town where silence ruled once night fell. Most of the time, the nighttime emergencies were routine: minor falls, fevers, or the occasional small injury. But that night, things changed forever. The wind was slamming against the windows, and the sound of the rain was almost deafening. I remember glancing at the clock just before everything began. 1:50 a.m. The hallways were quiet, almost empty. Some patients were sleeping, others under observation, and the on-call staff was trying to keep calm while the storm outside created an oppressive atmosphere. Suddenly, at 1:55 a.m., everything went dark. A complete blackout. The hospital was plunged into a darkness that, for some reason, didn't feel normal. It wasn't the typical blackout where you know the generator will kick in after a few seconds. No, this was different. There was a silence so profound that even the storm seemed to vanish for a moment. What unsettled me the most was the cold I felt. It wasn't the usual nighttime chill. It was something else. An icy draft swept through the hallways, and the overwhelming sensation of being watched became unbearable. I tried to rationalize it, maybe a temperature drop caused by the blackout. But then, something in the atmosphere shifted, something I can't precisely describe, but it sent shivers down my spine. The generators took longer than usual to come back on, and by the time the lights returned, something felt different in the hospital. It seemed like the darkness had brought something with it, something we couldn't see but that everyone could feel. That night was only the beginning of what turned into a series of strange events, always at the same time. 1:55 a.m. In the following days, the blackouts became routine, always at the same time, and always accompanied by that unsettling feeling that something else was present. At first, I thought they were just technical issues. But what baffled me the most were the patients' reactions. Some started reporting strange sensations: footsteps in the empty hallways, doors closing without reason, and most disturbing of all, voices. Voices they claimed to hear during the blackouts. Patients who were usually rational, some without any psychiatric history, looked at me with eyes full of fear, describing things I had refused to believe until that moment. The hospital staff began talking too, though always in whispers, as if they feared that speaking about it openly would make the phenomena worse. Everyone avoided the question that was hanging in the air. What exactly was happening at 1:55 a.m.? That's when I decided to investigate. I couldn't keep working through these strange blackouts without trying to understand what was happening. I went through reports, records, anything that might give me a clue, and I found it. On the night the blackouts began exactly at 1:55 a.m., a patient died. He was an elderly homeless man who had been admitted hours earlier with severe injuries. According to the report, he had been attacked, but the police were never able to find the culprit, and the case was filed as an unsolved crime. What disturbed me wasn't just the coincidence of the time of his death with the blackouts, but a detail that no one seemed to have noticed. The old man had spoken some words just before dying. A nurse who attended him told me that in his last breath, the man said, "I'm not done here. He's still after me." Those words stayed with me. What did they mean? Who was he referring to? The nurse assured me that at the time he didn't think much of it, but now, after everything that had been happening, the phrase took on a new meaning. Weeks passed and the phenomena continued. At 1:55 a.m., the lights would fail, the machines would stop working, and the hospital would fall into total darkness. No one dared walk the hallways during those minutes, but those who did claimed to have seen a figure, the silhouette of a man who vanished as soon as the lights returned. At first, I thought it was just talk, the result of collective fear. But one night, I saw it myself. I was in the emergency room checking on a patient when, suddenly, the blackout happened again. The generator took longer to kick in, and during those minutes of darkness, I felt a presence behind me. I turned slowly, and there in the hallway I saw it. It was just a shadow, but its shape was clearly that of a man. It didn't walk, it didn't move, it was just there, watching. My heart stopped for a second, and when the lights came back on, there was no one there. From that moment, I knew that what was happening in the hospital wasn't something that could be easily explained. I continued investigating and discovered that the old man had been attacked by someone who was never identified. The case, full of irregularities, seemed to hide something deeper. Maybe the killer was still out there, but what was clear was that somehow, the old man's soul wasn't at peace. I don't know if the mystery of what happened that night will ever be solved, but what I can tell you is that ever since, whenever the clock strikes 1:55 a.m. in that hospital, we all feel the same thing. A presence we can't see but that watches us from the darkness, waiting. I work at a small rural hospital, one of those places that has aged poorly over time. The walls are worn, the lights flicker every now and then, and the generator breaks down too often. No one is really surprised when the lights fail, but there's something about those blackouts that has always made my skin crawl. The first time I noticed it was several months ago, during my night shift. The lights began flickering as usual, but this time it felt different. At 1:30 in the morning, the hospital was plunged into darkness. Although the generator should have kicked the lights back on in a matter of seconds, it took longer than usual to start. During those seconds of darkness, a strange sense of tension washed over me, as if something or someone was waiting in the shadows. That time I was checking on the patients in the intensive care unit, and everything seemed in order. The monitors were humming, the machines were breathing for the patients, but there was something in the air, something I couldn't see but definitely felt. I walked down the hallway with my flashlight, and the beam seemed weaker than it should have been. At the end of the corridor, a shadow moved quickly, so fast that for a moment I thought it was just my imagination. I decided not to mention it to anyone. The same thing happened the following night. The generator failed again, the lights flickered, and during those seconds of darkness, I felt a presence. I couldn't see it, but I knew it was there. I don't know how to explain it, but the sensation was the same every time the lights went out, as if something was waiting for that exact moment. Power outages weren't uncommon, but I started noticing that they always happened at the same time, and always in the intensive care unit. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something behind these electrical failures. The shadows seemed deeper and the air heavier. One night, while doing my usual rounds, the blackout happened again. I was walking down the hallway when the lights went out completely. This time the darkness lasted longer than usual, and in the middle of it, I felt a cold breeze run down my back as if someone had passed close to me. There were no open windows, no drafts, but that feeling was as real as anything I had ever felt before. I didn't want to panic, so I carried on with my duties, although I noticed that the patients in the unit seemed more restless during the blackouts. Some muttered in their sleep, others moved their hands uneasily as if they were feeling the same thing I was. Everything became strange, as if a heavy, dense energy had taken over the place. I decided to share what I was feeling with a colleague, but the response I got was expected. It's stress. It happens in every hospital. While I tried to convince myself that they were right, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more behind all of this. One night, while I was reviewing the file of one of the more critical patients, a blackout longer than usual caught me by surprise. Everything went silent. Not even the hum of the monitors could be heard. The generator took a while to start, and for a few minutes the hospital was submerged in a disturbing darkness. Then, in the midst of that darkness, I heard it. It wasn't a loud sound, more like a whisper, something so soft it was barely audible but clear enough to make my skin crawl. It seemed to come from the end of the hallway, where there was no one but me. I moved forward slowly with the flashlight even though I didn't want to. Each step felt heavier, and the air colder. Halfway down the hall, the light flickered, but this time it wasn't just the flashlight. When I looked up, I saw something move in the shadows. It was just a dark silhouette, but its presence stopped me in my tracks. I couldn't tell if it was a person or just a trick of the light, but what I did know was that I wasn't alone. Finally, the lights came back on, and the figure disappeared. I stood still for a few seconds, trying to process what I had just seen. There was no logical explanation for it, but there was no way to explain it without sounding paranoid either. The blackouts continued over the following days, and every time they happened, that same feeling would take hold of me. Some of my coworkers also began noticing strange things, but no one wanted to talk about it openly. It seemed like we all knew something wasn't right, but we preferred not to give it a name. Over time, I began to notice a pattern. Every time there was a blackout, one of the more critical patients would worsen. It wasn't immediate, but always, after those nights when the lights failed, their vital signs would inexplicably drop. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that everything had a medical explanation, but deep down, I knew it wasn't true. One night after another particularly long blackout, one of the patients died. They were in critical condition, but their death was sudden. The official cause was cardiac arrest, but deep down, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had been feeling over those weeks. As if something or someone in the hospital was causing those blackouts, something we couldn't see. I don't know what happens in this hospital when the lights go out, but what I experienced left me with many questions. My name is Julian, and I've been working as a nurse in the intensive care unit of a small-town hospital for over 10 years. Throughout the years, I've seen it all. Death, though never easy, becomes a kind of constant companion when you work in a place like this. At first it was hard for me, just like it is for everyone, feeling that helplessness when you see someone pass away, unable to do anything but be there for them in their final moments. But with time, you learn to cope with it. Or at least that's what I thought. A few months ago, something started to change. I'm not sure how to explain it without sounding crazy, but it all started with an elderly man, Don Manuel, who had been in critical condition for days. His family no longer expected a miracle, and the doctors knew it too. I was on my night shift when, suddenly, the monitors started to show a slight rise in his vital signs. A spike in oxygen levels and heart rate, nothing drastic, but enough to catch my attention. I quickly approached, thinking he might be improving, but just at that moment, Don Manuel stopped breathing. I thought the equipment had malfunctioned, that something was wrong with the monitors. I spoke to the doctors, but they told me that those fluctuations sometimes happen, that there was nothing to worry about. I believed them, at least for that night. A few days later, something similar happened. Another patient, an elderly woman named Doña Rosa, was in her final moments. This time, the spike in her vital signs was even shorter, but it was enough for me to notice. And again, just seconds later, she passed away. That's when I began to worry. Coincidence? Maybe. But my mind couldn't stop turning it over. Why just before death? It was as if, in those last moments, the body was desperately clinging to something. Maybe life. At first, I didn't give it too much thought, but as the weeks went by, this pattern started repeating itself. Always at night, always when I was on shift, always a slight spike, a final breath, and then death. My colleagues didn't notice, or at least they didn't mention it. It was as if I was the only one who could see those small fluctuations, those almost imperceptible signs. I didn't know if I was losing my mind or if something else was really happening. I admit I started to obsess a little. I reviewed the patient's medical records, trying to find some connection between them. But there was nothing. Some were elderly, others had suffered serious accidents, and others simply succumbed to diseases that no longer had a cure. There was no clear pattern beyond that final breath. I remember one night in particular. I was taking care of a young man, barely in his 30s. He'd been in a car accident, and his chances of survival were minimal. He was alone in his room. His parents lived far away and hadn't been able to get there yet. While I monitored his vital signs, I saw the now familiar spike on the monitors. It was just a flicker, but there it was. I got closer, worried, and at that precise moment the man opened his eyes. He didn't say anything, but his gaze locked onto mine. It was as if he wanted to tell me something, as if he were asking for help. But before I could react, his eyes went blank, and the monitor showed a flat line. That night I went home with a knot in my stomach. I couldn't sleep. The feeling of helplessness was overwhelming. What was happening? Why was I the only one who seemed to notice? As time went on, I started having nightmares. In them, I saw the patients who had died during my shifts. They were sitting in their beds, their eyes fixed on me, as if they were waiting for me, as if they wanted me to understand something I couldn't grasp. I would wake up in the middle of the night, sweating, with the feeling that someone was watching me from the darkness. I decided I couldn't go on like this. There was something in those final moments that was affecting me more than I could bear. So, I began talking to the patients before they died, even if they were unconscious. I would tell them that I was there for them, that they weren't alone. I don't know if it changed anything, but it made me feel better, as if in some way, I was fulfilling my duty until the very end. One of the last times it happened was with a woman named Clara. She had been in a coma for days, and the doctors had already told her family that there was nothing more to be done. That night, just before she passed away, the monitors once again showed that slight increase in her vital signs. I approached her bed, and although I knew she couldn't hear me, I whispered that everything was okay, that she could rest. When the monitor showed a flat line, I felt a strange peace, but also an unease that I couldn't shake. I was convinced that those final breaths, those brief fluctuations, weren't just equipment failures or natural bodily reactions. It was something more, something I couldn't fully understand, but that kept happening more and more often. Over the months, I've thought a lot about what it could mean. Maybe those breaths are the soul's last efforts to cling to life, or perhaps they're a form of farewell, a way to make their presence felt one last time before leaving. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand it, but every time it happens, I'm left with the feeling that, in those final moments, we are closer to the inexplicable than we could ever imagine. Maybe there's no clear answer, but what I do know is that those final breaths have taught me something. Sometimes, death isn't just an ending, but a kind of silent communication that goes beyond what we can see or understand. A few years ago, I worked in a hospital that always had a somewhat heavy atmosphere. I couldn't quite tell if it was the environment or if I was simply worn out, but something about that place never made me feel entirely comfortable. It was an old hospital with long, poorly lit hallways and high ceilings that made every step echo more than usual. I remember one night in particular, one that remains etched in my memory as if it had happened yesterday. It was a night shift, like many others, and it wasn't unusual for the hospital to be quiet at that hour. My area of responsibility was the cardiology ward, and although there was always activity, the nights were generally calmer. Everything began around 2 in the morning. I had just finished checking on the patients when suddenly, the phone at the nurses' station rang. The odd thing was that, at that hour, the phone rarely rang. Most calls came through the reception desk, and if something urgent happened, we were usually notified through other means. At first, I thought it was either a colleague or a wrong number. However, when I picked up the receiver, all I heard was silence on the other end. I tried speaking, asked who was calling, but there was no answer. All I could hear was some kind of interference, like static, and then a faint whisper, as if someone was speaking from far away. I didn't think much of it and hung up. It could have easily been a technical glitch. But just a few minutes later, the phone rang again. This time, the feeling was different. Something inside me tightened. I answered once more, but again, there was only static on the other end, and again, the unintelligible whispering. This time, though, the sound seemed a little clearer, but it was still impossible to make out what was being said. I hung up a second time, but now I was no longer calm. I wasn't sure if it was my imagination, but I felt a pressure in the air. The empty hallways and the silence of the hospital only amplified my discomfort. I decided to continue with my work, but as I passed one of the patient's rooms, I heard something that stopped me. One of the monitors started beeping, signaling that a patient's vital signs were fluctuating. I approached to see what was going on and saw that the patient, an elderly man who had suffered a heart attack a few days earlier, was awake and staring intently at the door. I asked him if he was all right, if he needed anything. I looked into his eyes, but he didn't respond right away. After a few seconds, he simply said, "She's here." That chilled me to the bone. I asked him who he was talking about, but he just pointed towards the hallway. Of course, there was no one there. I tried to calm him, telling him he might be confused or dreaming, but he looked at me with such seriousness that I was left speechless. I decided to let him rest and continued my rounds. The hallway felt colder than usual, but I convinced myself it was all just coincidence. Until, once again, the phone rang. When I answered this time, there was no static. What I heard was a voice. Weak, broken, almost a whisper. I could barely make out what it was saying, but it sounded like a woman, and what little I could understand was something like, "Help me. I'm lost." My body froze on the spot. I didn't know what to say. I tried asking who she was, if she needed help, but before I could continue, the call disconnected. This time, I didn't hang up. The line just went dead on its own, as if the call had never happened. I decided to check the call log in the system just to confirm that I wasn't imagining things. However, to my surprise, there was no record of any incoming calls at that time. None. What I had heard shouldn't have been possible. In the days that followed, I tried not to dwell too much on it. Work at the hospital continued, and although the uneasy feeling lingered, I hadn't received any more strange calls. That was, until one of my colleagues on shift told me something that left me deep in thought. She said that many years ago there had been a nurse who worked in the same hospital. Apparently, during a medical emergency, a mistake on her part led to a patient's death during her shift. After that, guilt consumed her, and she ended up taking her own life. It was said that on the quietest nights, you could still hear her footsteps in the hallways, or even receive calls from an unknown number. I don't know if what happened to me that night is related to that story, but what I do know is that ever since then, whenever the phone rings during the night shift, something inside me tightens. I can't help but think about that weak voice asking for help from somewhere beyond what we can understand. Maybe it's just another legend, or maybe something or someone is still trapped in those long hallways, unable to find rest. I don't have the answer, but that night changed something in me. I can't ignore the possibility that sometimes what we believe is just a story has deeper roots than we can imagine.